U.S. democracy in the last 7 months has collapsed into what Luke and Wei and I call competitive authoritarianism. Democracies don't die like they used to. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns in coups like those of Franco in Spain, Pinochet in Chile, or Park Chung-hee in South Korea. Today, the vast majority of democracies die at the hands of elected leaders, presidents and prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. So I think you're right in your diagnosis that the Biden administration was unable to do enough to revert the situation and prevent Trump's return to power. I think some of it was outside of his control, which I'll get back to. The one clear advice that I would give, if I could go back in time, is to actually do what was done in South Korea, which is that the Biden administration was very, very uneasy, very reluctant to prosecute Trump, because it's never happened in the United States. We've never prosecuted a former president. And it's viewed as somehow, I don't know, something that we just don't do. So they waited 2 years to begin the prosecution. And that's what allowed delays in the case to be such that Trump was never convicted of the crimes. He was convicted of more minor crimes, but not of the crimes against democracy that he clearly committed. And so Biden could have been, and I think should have been, much more aggressive in prosecuting Trump. Levels of public discontent in almost every democracy in the world are very high. People are angry, they're grumpy, and they're voting against incumbents. So what happened to Joe Biden, or Kamala Harris, who was the representative of the incumbent, was what's happening to incumbents in all of the world. Germany, France, UK, South Korea. The Sanchez government in Spain can't figure it out. Macron in France can't figure it out. Schultz in Germany couldn't figure it out. Starmer in the UK can't figure it out. This is a problem across democracies. And the problem in the United States was we had a two-party system, and if the incumbent party was unpopular and didn't win, the alternative was an authoritarian. And you can blame Biden, but there's clearly something going on globally that was hindering his effort to build public support. In our book, How Democracies Die, we focus on two such norms in particular. One of them is mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of our opponents. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. The second norm is a little more complex. It's what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of deliberate self-restraint and underutilization of one's power. But in How Democracies Die, Daniel and I warned that those norms were unraveling in the United States in the early 21st century. Mutual toleration was disappearing. Republicans and Democrats were starting to treat one another as an existential threat. That is a problem, because when mutual toleration disappears, politicians start to abandon forbearance. Well, these are tricky concepts, and their mutual toleration and forbearance are kind of counterintuitive. They're not sort of the way you naturally think. They're pretty new. You can disagree with me. We may have different views about how to respond to North Korea. We may have different views on social spending versus taxes, but and we may not even like each other very much. But we have to accept one another as legitimate, meaning I have to truly believe that even though I think I'm right and you're wrong, that you have a legitimate right to speak your views and to compete for power. And if you win, I may be unhappy and I may, swear a little bit and kick the couch, but I have to accept that that is okay. Pluralism, accepting the legitimacy of our rivals, allowing them to compete legitimately against us, is a very, very new invention. It took a few decades for the American founders to learn that. And it's been very, very hard in democracies, new democracies, everywhere. It is vital in a democracy that you and I disagree, that we have different views, that we compete against each other. Not only is that okay in a democracy, it's necessary in a democracy. But at the same time that you and I disagree and we compete and we disagree, we have to draw a limit. We have to accept that that there are limits of fair play. Like in a sport, I always use sports metaphors, right? You in a football match, you try hard to beat the other. You don't like the other team. You do everything you can, at least legally, to defeat, but you can't take out a knife and knife the other team. You can't do something that takes the other team off the field, because then you have no game. And if we want to keep a democracy, if we like playing football, if we want to keep playing games of football, we know that we can't kill the other team. We have to know that they have a right to exist. And so democracy requires intense competition and a lot of polarization. That's fine. But we have to know at the end of the day that that's legitimate opposition, that they're not an enemy, that they're not a subversive, that they're not a criminal, they're not a traitor, they're just our rival. Mm-hmm. And that's a very hard thing for democracies to figure out. It's maybe the hardest thing for democracies to figure out. Very often, it's societies that experience severe polarization and then descend either into civil war, like the United States did, or like Spain did in the 1930s, or they descend into dictatorship because the polarization rips the country apart, and you get, Pinochet in Chile, or Franco in Spain, or Hitler in Germany, or Mussolini in Italy. Societies that have suffered from a lack of mutual toleration, where polarization ripped the parties apart, where they did start treating each other like enemies, and they lose the game. They lose democracy entirely. It's those societies often that learn how to build mutual toleration. So really quickly, why did norms of mutual toleration and forbearance break down in the early 21st century? Daniel and I argue that it was extreme polarization. This is actually a parallel to South Korea. Losing one's dominant status can feel like an existential threat. For democracy to work, parties have to be able to tolerate losing. Nobody likes losing. When parties, or particularly their supporters, perceive losing to pose an existential threat, they radicalize. They try to win at any cost. In other words, we argue that it is an outsized fear of losing, an exaggerated fear of losing, that leads parties to turn away from democracy. If you asked me when we wrote How Democracies Die 8 years ago, I would have leaned towards the Democrats using caution and forbearance. That did not work in the United States. The Republican Party continued to radicalize, and now the Democratic Party is faced with not a question of moderation or extremism, but it's a question of using constitutional hardball. If you are faced with an openly authoritarian party in power, as we are in the United States, does the Democratic Party continue to adhere to norms, or does it start to use all the tools in front of them and engage in constitutional hardball? And that debate has shifted. My own view has shifted. And now I think the authoritarian threat is so great that the Democrats have to use hardball. Or one of the lessons I think that liberals learned in Europe in the 1930s is that liberalism and adherence to the law and institutions and fair play is not enough by itself to fend off authoritarian threats, that liberals have to be aggressive and muscular in their defense of democracy. This gave birth to the militant democracy school that I talked about in my lecture. And we're seeing that in Brazil. The Brazilian Supreme Court has been very aggressive, has used hardball to make sure that it keeps Bolsonaro out of the race. And we're now seeing very belatedly the Democratic Party start to do that here. There is this effort pushed by Trump to redistrict the seats in the state of Texas to give the Republicans an additional advantage in the next legislative election. And the Democrats, for the first time, have come back and said, okay, if you do that, we're going to redistrict in the state of California, which we run, so we have so we can win back an additional seats, which means if you play dirty, we're going to play dirty too. Again, in general, I think that's a bad idea. I think you end up with an escalation and a spiraling that can kill democracy. But when one party has become so extreme and so authoritarian that it has already escalated and already spiraled and is threatening democracy, then you reach a moment where the moderate party has to fight back and play dirty as well. And unfortunately, in the United States, I think that's where we are. Now, one of the tricky things about competitive authoritarianism is that the formal institutions of democracy remain intact. There's still elections, Congress continues to operate, Constitution is still intact. So it's often hard for citizens, even political scientists, but especially citizens, to tell when they've lost their democracy. So how do we know? How do we know when we've crossed the line into authoritarianism? I want to suggest the following very simple metric. How costly is it to legally to engage in opposition to the government? It's very hard to know exactly where that line is, and there's always a debate. And here in the United States, analysts and politicians have been debating that very question for 7 or 8 years, and people disagree. The first answer is that we really don't know, and we will it'll always be difficult to identify that line. Secondly, I would say is as long as there are viable institutional channels to compete, then I would hold on to norms of forbearance for as long as possible. Norms of forbearance, rare, they're difficult to build, they're difficult to establish, and once you lose them, they're very hard to get back. So they're like a precious commodity. And so one should be conservative, very cautious about abandoning them. And so as long as there are institutional channels to compete without violating norms, I would not violate norms. And so, for example, in Trump's first presidency, the Democrats, the courts continued to be an important option, and the Democrats continued to have elections as a viable option. They easily won the 2018 legislative elections, and they were able to win the presidency in 2020. So it makes sense that they did have alternatives. Now we have Trump in power and much more authoritarian than the first term, and is threatening the 2026 election. Like, it's possible that the Democrat, if they go ahead with this gerrymandering in Texas, the redistricting in Texas. So now we're in a position where the authoritarians are in power and are shutting down, or at least potentially shutting down institutional channels of access. That's where you have to think about, okay, now is the time to abandon norms. The other thing that's important is, in a polarized context, it is really, really important always to seek out allies or partners, or at least people you can tolerate on the other side. And so I think a handful right-wing members of the National Assembly who voted for Yoon's impeachment, that's very important. It's really important to be able to find people on the right, people who call themselves conservative, people who still call themselves Republican, and say, look, this is a decent person who I can work with, who I can treat in a civil manner, who I can talk to, who I can adhere to norms with. As long as those people exist, it's very important to seek them out, to be active and energetic in working with them as much as possible. And we had a similar situation in the United States where a fraction of the Republican Party, the most important figure in this group was Liz Cheney, the daughter of former Vice President Cheney, who stood up for democracy, who opposed Trump, and who lost her political career because of it. She and her allies were expelled from the Republican Party and became orphans. Unfortunately, conservatives who were not for Trump, conservatives who defended democracy, became a small, politically orphaned, isolated faction that has almost disappeared. But if we're going to depolarize, if we're going to rescue democracy in the United States, they are going to be important partners in that. Because no democracy ever survived with just one party. There have to be two, at least, two or more pro-democratic parties. Democracies need pro-democratic left of center parties. They also need pro-democratic right of center parties. And to imagine that, well, they're all bad, let's just get rid of them, that's a road to destruction. No democracy ever survived with just one party. The United States is experiencing what Daniel Ziblatt, Luke and Wei, and I call a great abdication. Democratic abdication occurs when the people who have the authority and the responsibility to defend democracy choose not to do so. Our leading politicians, judges, media owners, business, union, and religious leaders are failing to carry out the basic responsibility to defend democratic institutions. One by one, they are acquiescing to authoritarianism. Why is this happening? Part of the explanation, I think, has to do with the absence of a collective memory of authoritarianism. One of the challenges I imagine in South Korea is that economically the dictatorship was so successful. Inevitably, because of the economic success, particularly in the Park government, people associate authoritarianism with at least good economic times. And it's much easier in South Korea to have nostalgia for authoritarianism than in Argentina. I see Germany and the United States as the two extremes. Germans have no choice but to remember. You can't walk a block in Berlin without encountering a memorial, either to communism or to Nazism. And Americans do everything to forget, right? We built our very big country. We erected our first monument to memorialize lynching in the United States in the 2010s. We don't have monuments. We are rebuilding statues memorializing Confederate soldiers. That's not how you build a memory culture. Or it's not how you build a democratic memory culture. Yes, I mean, it's important to say that South Korea's democratic crisis is not over. It hasn't been permanently resolved. The problem of pretty extreme polarization and widespread use of constitutional hardball persists. So, but I do think, and I'm not an expert in South Korean politics, that South Korea did respond more aggressively and more effectively than the United States. In the two ways that you point to, bringing someone who attacked democracy, to removing them from power, bringing them to justice, considerable societal mobilization, actually not only in 2024, but also several years earlier during the Park government, which maybe was not, never went as far as declaring martial law, but engaged in some abuses and faced considerable societal pushback. So those are very positive things. It's also positive, I think, that at least a faction of the ruling party voted for impeachment, and which is something that we don't see in the United States. It was a very small and ultimately insignificant faction in the United States that supported impeaching Trump. So those were good signs. But the key is when you overcome a crisis like South Korea's, or like the United States after January 6th, the key is learning from the crisis, being able to step back and and develop a new way of doing politics. And I am less sure that that's happened, at least yet in South Korea. But what South Koreans did in December and January was historical. And the mobilization, the immediate mobilization to stop the declaration of martial law was absolutely decisive. And as I tell my students, that's how you defend democracy. And South Korea is not the only only country offering lessons to Americans, but it's one of the most important. And the folks who saved democracy in South Korea, a complicated set of actors, but it was mostly society, K-pop kids in the streets, and that's really important. And Americans need to learn from that.
But, and this is an important point, democracies can't defend themselves. Constitutions are just pieces of paper. They're pieces of paper, and they have to be made to work by people. All democracies everywhere are vulnerable to threats from within. Just simply holding elections inevitably creates at least some opportunity for anti-democratic forces to win power. And I think there are basically three broad ways in which democracies can protect themselves from threats from within. The most muscular approach is to empower the state itself, to empower state authorities to ban candidates and parties that threaten democracy. This is what's called the militant democracy school. Advocates of militant democracy argue that it's really naive to allow illiberal, undemocratic forces to compete freely for power, like we do in the United States. We've seen several examples in the last 5 years of democracies in which state officials took aggressive action to either prosecute authoritarian politicians or to keep authoritarian politicians out of the electoral arena. Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro has been banned from holding office for 8 years and is now on trial, likely to be convicted for trying to organize a coup. In South Korea, President Yoon was impeached and prosecuted for his declaration of martial law. In Romania, the Supreme Court canceled an election when a dubiously democratic candidate backed by Russia came out of nowhere and finished first. They held another election won by another candidate. That is the exercise of militant democracy. Now that's controversial. It's not seen as sort of culturally appropriate in the United States to ban candidates and parties from competition. So if you're like Americans and you don't want to empower state officials to ban candidates and parties, then politicians have to do it themselves. This is the second strategy. It's what Daniel Ziblatt and I call partisan gatekeeping. Democracy can only survive when mainstream politicians actively work to keep authoritarian extremists out of mainstream politics. It means expelling authoritarian extremists from your party. It means refusing always to nominate or support anti-democratic candidates. And it means working with people from across the ideological spectrum to forge broad pro-democratic coalitions to isolate and defeat illiberal forces. We've seen coalitions like that successfully defeat illiberal forces recently in Poland and in France. Now, if both the state and the political elite fail to act against authoritarians, then it's up to civil society. This is the third strategy, what Daniel and I call societal mobilization. Civil society leaders have to actively defend democratic norms. Business leaders, union leaders, church leaders, university leaders, intellectuals, anybody with a certain credibility in society and leadership role in society must always take the lead in reminding citizens that there are certain red lines out there that can never be crossed. We saw this last year in Germany when the far-right AfD party was revealed to be linked to a plan to organize mass deportations, which was reminiscent of Nazi-era deportations. When that happened, when that revelation happened, business leaders, labor leaders, Catholic bishops, all publicly denounced the AfD as anti-democratic. One leading Catholic bishop declared, and I quote, "Anyone wishing to deport other people denies their human dignity. The AfD has abandoned democratic principles and cannot be voted for by Catholics." There were massive citizen protests across Germany. In fact, for 7 weeks, more than 2 million people marched in cities across Germany in repudiation of the AfD. To recap, there are 3 broad ways to defend a democracy against threats from within. The most muscular strategy is militant democracy, empowering the state to prosecute and or ban anti-democratic forces. We see this recently in Brazil and South Korea. An alternative is for politicians to do it themselves through gatekeeping and through the forging of broad pro-democratic coalitions like in France and in Poland. If politicians fail to act, the last bastion of defense is society itself. And we've seen in different forms a pretty effective societal mobilization recently in Germany, in Israel, and of course in South Korea.